This is Peg Brady from NOAA Fisheries, and welcome to the 2025 NOAA Fisheries EBFM Seminar Series. Today, we're continuing the series that was initiated back in 2017, so it's been a while, but we've had some great speakers and a lot of enthusiasm about this series. The series is focused on increasing awareness about ecosystem-based management with a particular focus on fisheries, and highlight the progress that NOAA and our partners are making to enhance and implement EBM. Since the beginning, NOAA Library has been a great and valuable co-host to the series, and we appreciate all the support that they've given us. We have this seminar typically every second Wednesday of each month from 3 to 4 at the same time. Many apologies for having to cancel our February speaker. We had a last-minute family obligation, and our speaker could not join us because of that. And so we have rescheduled Kelly Dennett to speak on June 11th. So she will be back and join us at that time. So apologies for that last-minute cancellation. Today's presentation is Lisa Pfeiffer from our Northwest Fisheries Science Center. She's an economist out there doing research in this area, and we're really happy to have her join us today. Before I turn it over to Lisa, I'd like also to draw your attention to our speaker next month, and that will be Ryan Vandermeulen from our Office of Science and Technology, and he'll be focusing in on how satellite programs are supporting fisheries science and management. Very exciting area that Ryan will share with us on that date. So let me turn it over to Lisa at this point, and thank you so much, Lisa, for all your efforts in preparing for today, and look forward to hearing your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks again. Today, I'm going to be talking about an ongoing project called the Spatial Economics Toolbox for Fisheries, or FishSET is our acronym. We are calling this a toolbox for socio-ecological modeling in multi-use marine spaces, which I'll touch on many of those points kind of throughout the presentation. But I'd like to also introduce my co-authors. Again, I'm Lisa Pfeiffer. I'm a research economist at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center. Paul Carvalho is our lead programmer and acts as our project manager, and he works for the Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission. Anna Abelman is another programmer that's working closely on this project, also with Pacific States. Minyang Lee is another economist at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. And Alan Haney, who I would say is FishSET Emeritus, used to be at NOAA Fisheries and is now at ICES. But he was sort of the original instigator of this project. The QR code there will take you to the GitHub, to the website and GitHub of our toolbox, and you'll get to see that again at the end of the presentation. So I'd like to start by saying that understanding and predicting how fisheries, that is, the people who go out and harvest fish, respond to a dynamic world of changing markets, management, competing uses of marine space, communities, and the environment is central to NOAA Fisheries' work. In particular, it's central to the concept of ecosystem-based management, because this work helps us connect what happens in the environment to the value of ecosystem services that people use, as well as connect what people do in the environment as resource users back to the physical and biological environment. And the modeling framework that I'm talking about here, that we've incorporated into this toolbox, is meant to help us answer the questions about how do policy and environment impact fisher behavior. We're primarily thinking about external factors, such as different types of policies like marine protected areas, offshore wind energy development, places where people may be excluded from fishing for different reasons, different uses, catch shares, which changes the incentives around how people target fish, bycatch regulations, things like that, as well as the environment. So fluctuations in fish biomass, climate-induced species range shifts, and changes in habitat are all things that we can look at using this framework. But importantly, we can also consider factors such as heterogeneity within a fishing fleet, fishing costs, are other characteristics that we consider as we consider the behavioral changes potentially caused by these external factors. And the kind of fundamental modeling framework is centered around what we call discrete choice models. And these types of models have a long history in economics. They also have a long history in fisheries economics. In economics in general, people have used this framework to answer questions about kind of wide-ranging variety of topics, from why do people choose the houses that they choose to buy, where do kids go to college, the types of transportation that a person might choose to go to work. So wide-ranging policy questions. But in fisheries, we have this sort of unique opportunity to use this discrete choice modeling framework because we have a long history of collecting data about where fishermen start, a kind of port location, and where they go fishing. So where they've actually captured the fish. We can observe this information. We can also observe characteristics of those fishermen and of the locations from which they chose. And so we can set up this kind of modeling framework where a fisherman is choosing amongst locations that we have some information on, location A, B, C here in this very small example. And we can understand how different factors affect that choice. And so some things that we might include are things like expected CPUE. So what is the catch per unit effort that someone expects to get if they go to location A, B, or C? That's going to affect their decision about where to fish. We can add prices into that. So expected revenue, expected costs, how expensive is it? How much does it cost? How much time? How much fuel does it take to get to location A, B, or C? That's going to affect choice. Overall fleet effort, variability in catch, kind of tradition about where a particular fisherman generally fishes, are all things that might affect that choice, and we can incorporate into this modeling framework. And then what we can do is predict the redistribution of fishing effort based on some policy change. And so let's say an MPA was put into place that covered location C, and so people weren't allowed to fish there anymore. What this modeling framework helps us do is estimate the redistribution of fishing effort into the other choices that are available to fishers. We can also estimate the welfare loss or gain from that policy decision, from that policy change. And so more formally, if you're craving a more formal sort of layout of this discrete choice modeling framework, it's generally called a random utility model, where there are different probabilities of choosing different options from a choice set. The utility of a choice is a function of a deterministic component. So those factors, like I detailed in the previous slide, expected CPUE, expected revenue, costs, and a random error. And so that's what gives us this random utility framework. The model is estimated through maximum likelihood. And then there's also lots of extensions to kind of the basic modeling framework that have been explored in fisheries economics literature and other literatures. Some of these modeling extensions are available within the toolbox that we created, and others we're kind of in the process of incorporating. And I'll give you some examples later in the presentation. And so just to kind of set this framework in your head, I'll give an example, which is kind of a classic paper in this modeling world, which is about stellar sea lions and the Bering Sea pollock fishery. And so the question that these authors were asking is, what is the economic impact of closing a fishing ground for conservation? So there was a stellar sea lion die-off. Part of the reason for that die-off was that fishers were taking the fish that the stellar sea lions were eating. And so they made this big closure, and they wanted to estimate, what would the impact be on the fishery. They estimated there was a 13% profit loss per trip, and they were able to evaluate the effect of that closure on profit for different sized vessels. And that size can be defined in a bunch of different ways: length, horsepower, tons, different characteristics that you have about those about the vessels that were impacted. So some challenges to this framework is that the kind of data setup is pretty challenging. Fishery dependent data, which is fish data that's collected from fishermen, from fishing activities in various ways. That can be like from logbooks or VMS or delivery tickets. Those are all types of fishery dependent data. But just sort of setting up the data to run this type of model is pretty challenging. Another challenge is that researchers have been historically kind of opaque about their data processing assumptions and model choices. There's a lot of assumptions that have to be made up until getting a kind of data set that's ready to run. And all of those assumptions are pretty hard to detail in like a scientific paper, right? Kind of now in the age of GitHub, it's much easier to sort of replicate data cleaning steps, but kind of following what people have done in the past and comparing new models to old has been kind of challenging. There's also the challenge that researchers outside of economics or fisheries economics have an interest in implementing this type of model. So someone that's working on stock assessments or an ecosystem project where fishers are having an impact on the ecosystem through fish removal might be interested in understanding how that fishing behavior changes due to various changes either in ecosystem or external factors. And so building that into their model is something that they may want to do. But it can be challenging to read the kind of economics literature and understand what to do exactly. And then finally, as in all disciplines, it's kind of only the state of the art that gets published. But in policy frameworks, what we really want is the sort of tried and true. And we want basic modeling frameworks that will help us understand what's happening in the data, help us understand the drivers of behavior, and that's not necessarily going to get published in a journal, right? So those are the reasons that we've developed FishSET. And so what is FishSET? It's a toolbox in R. It contains data tools that include data management, QA/QC, and visualization tools. It also has modeling tools, so model design, model comparison, and model robustness, which really allow you to use a bunch of different options on your data and understand what your assumptions, how your assumptions are driving maybe your modeling outcomes. And then it's also a policy tool. So there's a policy simulation toolbox that allows you to, for example, simulate closures or other types of policies and do welfare analysis from that policy. This is a toolbox both in the R console, so kind of based in code, as well as a graphical user interface. And I'm going to show some screenshots of the GUI to sort of give you an idea of what you can do here. But keep in mind that the console version is kind of much more powerful and flexible, and the GUI is designed for maybe people who are not so strong programming in R. But I'll also tell you about some of the tools that we've developed to help people get started. So here's the GUI. It's a Shiny app that we've developed over the last couple of years. Again, it has nice graphic interfaces that help you look at your data, understand what's going on, Understand if your data is correct. For example, sometimes you map things and you find that half of your data is on land, and so you can go back maybe to the original data sender and say like, oh, I don't think this is right, and they can go back, do some corrections. So just helping you understand what is kind of in your data. The data requirements kind of for getting this type of model set up in FishSET include a primary data set. That's basically a data set where the rows are unique observations, either fishing trips or fishing hauls. So they can be individual effort locations within a fishing trip. And those have to have the basic data characteristics of date, time, when that happened, either where it started or where it ended. Generally, we're thinking about the departing port. Sometimes you may want to understand like where people are choosing to land their fish, which is a different question. And then basically like where they went fishing and how much they caught. So those are the basic data requirements. And then you also need a spatial data file where the boundaries of that spatial file define fishing zones. And so this can be like a grid system. That's the most common. It can be more complicated, different, hexagons or something like that. And it can also be kind of custom if there's different areas which that people are choosing from. For example, lakes, if you're studying recreational fishing and you're wanting to understand why people choose to fish at different lakes, then those can be your spatial data file. And we've got some flexible file formats that you can use for that. There is a QA/QC module within the FishSET toolbox that helps you understand things like outliers, removing rows of missing data, some basic spatial data checks. It just makes it easy to do. It's nothing that you can't do outside of FishSET in R, but it focuses on the characteristics of your data that you're going to need to run this type of model. This is just an example of the map viewer for the U.S. Atlantic sea scallop fishery, which is a example data set that we include in the download of FishSET. This is a made-up data set that's derived from the actual sea scallop fishery, so it's not real. It's not confidential as normal fishery data would be, but allows you to kind of get to know and practice with some real seeming data. Here's another view of kind of what you can do with mapping your data inside the GUI. And then it has tools for model design. So there's basically different statistical functions for your maximum likelihood estimation. We have a user manual that kind of goes through each of the types of likelihood functions that we include in the toolbox, as well as references where you can read papers and other studies that have used that type of model. And then it helps you define kind of your explanatory variables. There are basically two types of explanatory variables, those that interact with distance and those that are specific to each fishing location. So if you think about that picture that I had up where there was location A, B, and C, those locations A, B, and C might have different characteristics for which you have data on, right? Expected catch, some measure of sea surface temperature or bottom temperature, or abundance. So any measure that varies with the specific fishing location is that type of explanatory variable, and any other sort of is affected by distance. And so again, going back to the sort of formal model layout, this helps you understand what types of data that you need or you might want to use. So again, those grid varying variables, things like environmental variables or expected catch, and then alternative invariant variables. So something that's a characteristic of the individual that's making the choice. So for example, a fishing vessel has a vessel size. It might have a measurable fuel efficiency or the cost of travel. There might be some captain characteristics or crew characteristics, the number of crew, for example, that then are interacted with a distance matrix between that starting location and between each alternative location. And FishSET does this calculation for you to help you set up the data to run your model. And then there's a model output module. Obviously, you're going to get kind of the results of your model, some measures of goodness of fit. These are also all available again in the console version. There's some model robustness tools to allow you to do things like cross-validation or out-of-sample prediction to understand, kind of how your model is fitting, how it's performing, and how it may perform in a situation where you're doing an out-of-sample prediction. And then finally, there's a policy simulation module, and this is really set up to help you investigate the impacts of closures, of area closures for various reasons. That could be bycatch regulations, as I showed in that first paper example. It could be an energy development area where they're excluding fisheries for construction. It could be an MPA, all sorts of reasons why there might be areas. It could be a shipping zone. All sorts of reasons why areas might be excluded for fishing effort. And so this module allows you to actually like point and click and say, I want to close these particular areas to fishing. Can you now rerun my model and estimate the predicted welfare impacts and effort redistribution? And so we have a bunch of figures that are automatically generated to show you that the output of that policy simulation. So those are both in kind of figure form, where it shows you kind of what you've closed and how effort is redistributed, as well as welfare impacts. So as in the aggregate, how much are people better off or worse off because of this policy in estimation. So again, what I've just shown you is the FishSET GUI, which is a Shiny application that runs locally on your computer when you install it through the GitHub. The real powerhouse of this toolbox is the console version, which is also loaded when you download through the GitHub. I'll tell you at the end about some of the resources that we've created, but the Shiny app is really designed for analysts wanting to gain quick insights from their data. The console version is more flexible, more powerful, more stable, honestly, and is designed for scientists and fishery data analysts. You can do everything in the console that you can do in the GUI, including making these figures. You can also edit these figures, but you can also do much more in the console version. So what I'm going to do now is walk you through some current projects that are happening using FishSET, using this modeling framework. These are almost all kind of in progress. So don't take anything that I'm showing here as a final analysis. But it gives you some idea of kind of the breadth of projects that people are working on. And hopefully will give you some ideas of how perhaps your data or your question can be analyzed using this framework. So the first one I'll talk about is Walmo and Chan, looking at Hawaii's longline tuna fishery. Their data are from both logbooks and VMS, so very detailed information about where people are fishing. Some of the issues some of the questions that they're looking at are there's extensive prohibited areas, including the main Hawaii Islands, protected species zones, national monuments, and MPAs. There's also a southern exclusion zone that are triggered by interactions with false killer whales. There's a map that is under my video there, but it doesn't matter for what we're talking about. And then there's some climate change predictions. This 2023 paper suggests an overall 20% decrease to biomass of big eye tuna, which is what the longline fishery targets by 2050. And so they want to understand how that will affect the fishery and how that will affect the spatial distribution of the fishery. And so just some preliminary results to get an idea of what they were able to include in their model. Expected catch at each site. They also included sea surface temperature, as well as the oceanic Nino index, which is what is predicted to affect biomass in that climate change paper. And then they also have estimates of trip cost per kilometer. And so they include each of these things in their model. And then they're able to predict the spatial distribution of effort given the prediction in the change in the El Nino index. They estimate this model for each quarter of the year. I'm just showing one particular quarter 2. And so what they estimate is a 0.8 million pound big eye catch decrease, a decrease in catch. And then using market prices, they can estimate that that's about a $4.3 million decline in profits in just that one quarter. Another current project is from Chaji et al. This is assessing the impacts of offshore wind development, an analysis of the minimization of economic exposure of the scallop fishery through the regulatory process. And this is actually a paper that just came out. But they wanted to understand, how as areas are defined for offshore wind energy development, that generally means that they are asking for more information about particular areas that are proposed, and then kind of reducing the size of those areas into what actually gets leased for development. And so these figures here show some examples in the New York Bight and the Central Atlantic, how there were these large call for information areas that were then reduced to smaller areas that were eventually leased. And so they wanted to know things like, how did the economic exposure of scallop harvesters change through this area identification process? And so they were able to look at different métiers of the scallop fishery. Those are defined by kind of a combination of management and vessel size. And they were able to show that basically that area identification process greatly decreased the economic exposure of scallop fishermen when it got to the final lease areas that were eventually leased for offshore wind. Another current project is from Chen, Moynihan, Hamill, and Haney. This is called Modeling Profit Maximizing Behavior to Improve Stock Assessments. So this is really related to stock assessment science, and is trying to answer the question of, why do sometimes we see a stock assessment that's showing, really declining indices of fishable biomass, where in the actual fishery, fishermen might be saying, "Oh, we're catching tons of fish. We're finding fish everywhere. They look good. They look big. There's no problem here. Why is the stock assessment saying this?" And the basic answer, or the way that FishSET and sort of this modeling framework can deal with this difference, is that fishers are really good at fishing, right? They have an incentive to choose locations where the fishing is good. And at any given choice or haul occasion, they're going to pick, what they think is best for fishing. And so they systematically have higher harvests than, for example, a survey, which is randomly sampling the area for which the stock assessment covers in order to get an unbiased estimate through a biological model of abundance. And so these authors are asking, how can we supplement fishery independent data with fishery dependent data while considering this difference? So considering that fishers are choosing their location to fish while the survey is doing a random sample of fishing. And so what they do in this study is set up a simulated, basically biological stock assessment model where there's survey data that's feeding the biological model and estimating abundance. And then there's also a simulated fishery model. So from that biological model, they simulate a fishery that would essentially, choose locations to fish and produce fishery-dependent data, right? So you'd have information about the catches in those areas where fishermen chose to fish. Feed that into an econometric model, which is sort of the framework, the FishSET framework that we're talking about here, where you're trying to understand, given the choice locations, where did fishermen choose to fish? Correcting those fishery-dependent data estimates, and then using that in an estimating model that combines both survey data and that corrected fishery-dependent data. And because this is a simulation framework, you can then, increase the amount of survey data and decrease the amount of fishery-dependent data, eliminate the survey and just use fishery-dependent data, use fishery-dependent data that's corrected, but versus not corrected. So you can do all these, kind of simulations to understand, how that fishery, if and how that fishery-dependent data is able to enhance the stock assessment process. And they find it depends on lots of different characteristics, as you might expect, but it's a super interesting framework and application of this modeling framework. There's also a couple of projects at the Northwest Center that are looking at offshore wind area leasing in California and trying to understand how the trawl groundfish and the midwater hake fishing grounds overlap with wind energy leases in California. How might that effort redistribute if fisheries are excluded from these areas in the future? And how might climate-related shifts in the species distribution interact with the way that those areas overlap, as well as the way that those fishing effort redistributes? And then finally, there's a project in the Gulf that is also looking at offshore wind with the sort of background that oil and gas platforms have really changed Gulf fisheries by providing artificial reef habitat. The majority of red snapper landings, for example, in the central and western Gulf are taken from large-scale oil and gas platforms. And so these authors are wondering if offshore wind energy platforms could have similar effects, potentially in different places, or how fishing effort might redistribute if there are offshore wind energy platforms added to these areas. So hopefully that gives you a broad overview and lots of ideas about the way that this toolbox can be used. We've developed a bunch of resources to help people get started. One of those is the sample data set that I showed in an earlier slide of the scallop fishery on the East Coast. Again, that's a fake data set, but kind of looks like a real data set. So it's an example of the type of data that you might use for you to use your own data. There are 3 vignettes. Actually, I think there's 4 vignettes now. 2 of those vignettes use the scallop data. One of them, just kind of looks at the spatial overlap and a bunch of summary statistics about that data. The second actually uses it to estimate some models. One of the vignettes walks you through the creation of a grid. So you can create your own grid of any size, kind of for any spatial area in the world using that short little vignette. And the final one helps you develop your own likelihood function. So if there's a particular model that you may want to use or develop, that final vignette can help you do that. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more on the last slide. There's a video tutorial for the GUI. So Paul actually walks you through all of the steps of the GUI on a video that you can follow along with. You can also jump to particular topics if you're interested in just doing a certain thing in the GUI. There's a user manual, super extensive, talks about all the different models, all of the different ways of setting up data. There's a quick start guide. So if you're too anxious to look at the manual, the quick start guide will help you just start up. There's also helpful collaborators in the FishSET team, that is. So me, Paul, Anna, Minyang are all available to kind of answer questions. Really any level, from just answering questions to help you get started to helping you develop a question. Even something like co-authorship is potentially available. So we're really interested in getting people started on their own projects. You can be NOAA affiliated. You don't need to be NOAA affiliated. I guess the important thing is you have some data to work with. We also have some conference travel funding supposed to be available, somewhat on hold right now, but there should be conference travel funding available for folks using FishSET. Again, here's the website. All of these resources are available under the articles tab at the top of the webpage. And then finally, the QR code takes you to the website. We are really interested in having you kind of join our community of users. And we're also interested in helping us expand the different modeling capabilities with your own modeling and expertise if you have reason to develop those. We have a general FishSET email address, this nimps.fishset@noaa.gov. And you can also contact me, Lisa Pfeiffer at noaa.gov. Happy to answer questions or point you in the right direction. And I think I will end there, and I'm happy to take questions.
All right. Thank you for your presentation, Lisa. And with that, we have had a couple of questions come in. So I will start us off with those. Our first question, does the console allow consideration of the impact in increasing effort in areas that remain open? How are crowding effects modeled?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways to address crowding impacts. So in the sort of, I would say in the first cut of a model where you're interested in a closure that causes a redistribution of effort, right? That you make that closure and then you estimate that redistribution of effort. If you think that something that is impacting Fisher's decision is how many vessels are already in a particular area, which is a totally reasonable assumption, then you would want to put that in your estimating model to begin with, right? So you could do something like calculate the number of vessels in each grid cell at each choice occasion, and include that in your estimating model. And so, there's reason to believe that may be positive, right? If people are attracted to places where other people are fishing because they know there's fish, or that might be negative where they don't want to fish where somebody else is fishing. So that would be one way to incorporate that kind of crowding effect. So the implication there is that that would be negative. And then so when you estimate that redistribution of effort, people would be less likely to go to other areas where more vessels have redistributed to.
We've had another question about modeling. In displacing effort, how do you model crowding of fishing effort and declining catch rates in the decision model?
Yeah, so I guess sort of the same idea. You would have to include some measure of both crowding or the number of vessels in different areas, as well as the potential catch rates in different areas. It would there may be some kind of two-step modeling process that you could incorporate, where you're estimating the model with first what you assume that the catch rates would be given the status quo, and then given the redistribution of effort, you would re-estimate the catch per unit effort given that redistribution of effort, and then kind of predict that model. So there's some probably different ways to go about that. But again, kind of thinking about how flexible the model is, and how you can incorporate different both biological or ecological factors, as well as kind of economic or behavioral factors, is kind of key to setting that up.
Our next question is it possible to use this toolbox for Mexican Pacific fisheries, and then in particular for artisanal fisheries at Jalisco State's Costa Alegre?
Yeah, so the toolbox itself is totally location agnostic. So it's only the toolbox. Like I said, it comes with an example data set that is the scallop fishery in the Northeast. But you can provide your own spatial grid. Again, there's a vignette to develop that grid if you need one, or if you already have maybe a grid that fisheries management uses, for example, or some other spatial spatial file that defines what you might think of as fishing location choices. That can be anywhere in the world. The toolbox is local to your computer, so you install it from our GitHub, and that means that you're just running it locally. Like you're not sharing data. This data is almost always confidential because it's an individual fishing business, fishing choices, so that the data is really only only shareable with a non-disclosure agreement, and all kinds of admin things. So it's just running locally on your computer. There are different tools to deal with that confidentiality. For example, if you don't want to show on your map any areas with whatever your confidentiality rules say. Here in the US, it's usually less than 3 vessels. So if you don't want it to show any grid cells with less than 3 vessels, you can define that at the beginning. And so yeah, definitely, anywhere, any place, any question where you have data that's kind of appropriate.
Our next question, any examples from Alaska?
Yes. Alan Haney, who was sort of the original instigator of the project, was an economist at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center. And so he actually has a bunch of papers that use this framework. Maybe not FishSET specifically, as it was in development at the time. But that very first example that I showed about stellar sea lions was one example. There's some other great examples. I think, basically Google scholaring Alan Haney will come up with a lot of good examples.
Our next question, sorry if you spoke on this, I missed the first 5 minutes. Can the framework model spillover effects from closure?
Yeah, so I'll try to sort of explain this again. There's different ways that you can kind of characterize spillover effects. One is just kind of the increase in effort in different areas where people have redistributed to, right? So there's a closure, and then people decide where else to expend their fishing effort. And so there are probably going to be other areas that have increases in fishing effort. And so that's kind of one type of spillover, right? That may have implications for example, crowding. If vessels don't like to fish in places where other, stock spillover. Okay, let me get to that. If people don't like to fish where other people are fishing, that could be included in the model. If it affects CPE, that could be included in the model. So something like stock spillover, I guess it can certainly be incorporated into that kind of expected catch formulation, where you're trying to understand, or you're trying to model what the expected catch of each particular zone is. Hopefully that answers your question. Otherwise, definitely we can follow up.
And then I know you touched on this already, but just in case there's any more to add to it, does the model rely on proprietary data from NOAA?
Nope, it doesn't. It doesn't. So you can download the full toolbox. It comes with a data set that is an example data set, but it's anonymized and kind of looks like a proprietary data set from NOAA, but it isn't. It's just a made up data set. But yeah, the idea is you can use the full toolbox on your own data locally without having to share. Without it being public in any way.
Our next question, Alaska has several processing plants close. Can this model support determining what impact that has?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and a really complicated question from a lot of different angles. So I think you'd want to think about what exactly impact you're trying to measure. One way that I can think about this is, when people are out fishing, they're then deciding which plant to deliver their catch to. So you could think about a model where the starting location is actually where they're fishing, and the ending location is the location of various processing plants. And you could estimate that model using historical data when those processing plants were open. Then you could, close the ones that closed, and you could try to understand how people redistribute their deliveries based on the options that are now available to them. And that would have implications for the cost of fishing, right? So they might have to travel further. They might have to wait longer, some things like that. So if you could incorporate some of those cost measures. And then it might also have implications for the kind of total, deliveries that a processor then gets, that a community that's then, at the community level. So kind of understanding those impacts on a community level is a different type of modeling framework. But equally interesting and important. But it may be that kind of location choice, delivery location choice model helps you get to something like community impacts.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And that looks like that is all the questions that we've had come in through the Q&A. Thank you, everyone who submitted those for us. And thank you, Lisa, for joining us here today and presenting your work and sharing it with us. Peg, do you have any last comments?
No, I just wanted to thank Lisa. Excellent presentation, and thanks to you and your co-authors on this. Wonderful work. Just a reminder, come back and join us on April 9th to learn a little bit more about what the satellite programs are doing in terms of supporting fishery science and management. Thank you.
Thank you all for attending. We hope to see you next month. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.